It began before sunrise on the first day of October. A deep, vibrating siren tore through the silence of Yaroslavl, an ancient Russian city 250 kilometers northeast of Moscow. For a moment, everyone thought they already knew the culprit, another long-range kamikaze drone from Ukraine. For months, the Kremlin's proud energy network had been relentlessly struck, one refinery after another, stretching hundreds of kilometers beyond the front lines. But this time was different. The rhythm of panic felt heavier, more uncertain. As the smoke rose above the city's skyline, the first images hit Telegram. Columns of thick black fumes rolled across the early morning sky, not the grey of an industrial fire, but a darkness so dense it mirrored the war itself. Within hours, those images had spread across social media, verified by geolocation experts. Yet the Kremlin's response was deafening silence. State TV presenters, usually quick to blame, Ukraine hesitated. They called it a minor technical fault, a glitch, nothing more. Then came a statement that shattered that fragile facade. Governor Mikhail Evraev of Yaroslavl appeared before the cameras. His words were calm, deliberate, and terrifying. There has been no drone attack recorded in the region today. The fire was caused by human error. He did not say accident. He did not say negligence. Instead, his tone carried the weight of something darker. Inside Russia, those two words, human error, became a signal. This was not an ordinary failure. It was sabotage. In that moment, the Kremlin faced an impossible choice. Two disasters, each deadly in its own way. Either Moscow admitted that a Ukrainian drone had breached its multi-layered air defense, those billion-dollar S-400 systems it boasted as impenetrable, or it confessed that an organized enemy existed inside its borders, capable of striking a strategic facility under the supposed watch of the FSB. Vladimir Putin chose the second narrative, admitting a drone strike would expose Russia's military weakness to the world, an intolerable humiliation. But blaming sabotage turned the fear inward, an invisible enemy among its own people. A ghost army operating behind the lines. That single decision revealed the true fracture inside modern Russia. The refinery at the heart of this drama, the YANOS plant, was not just an industrial site. It was a symbol of national power. One of the 5 largest refineries in Russia, it processed over 15 million tons of crude oil every year, around 5% of the entire nation's capacity. It was the bloodstream of Russia's war machine, feeding tanks, fighter jets, and the military convoys that sustained the front. Destroying it meant more than burning steel and oil. It meant cutting off the arteries that kept an empire alive. And whoever planned this attack, whether a Ukrainian operation or an underground Russian resistance, knew exactly where to strike. As night fell, the blaze still raged. Sirens echoed through Yaroslavl while officials avoided the word terrorism. The Kremlin's silence only deepened suspicion. Across Russia's social networks, one question began to spread like wildfire. If the enemy is already inside, how far can the flames reach next? By dawn, the inferno at YANOS had grown into a blazing wound across Russia's industrial landscape. The flames visible for kilometers were not random, they were surgical. Investigations by open-source analysts soon revealed that the strike had hit the most delicate organs of the refinery: catalytic cracking units, hydrogen compressors, and reformer tubes, all vital for producing high-grade diesel and jet fuel. These components were not ordinary machinery. They were high-tech imports from Europe and Japan, nearly impossible to replace under the current sanctions regime. Whoever planned the operation understood that destroying a few critical units could paralyze the entire complex for months, perhaps even years. YANOS was never just another refinery. It was one of Russia's 5 most important energy facilities, producing nearly 1/20th of the nation's refined fuel. But its true value lay in what it produced, the lifeblood of modern warfare. According to industry data, YANOS specialized in Euro 5 standard diesel for precision engines, such as those powering Russia's newest T-90M tanks. It also produced the aviation fuel that kept Su-34 and Su-35 fighter jets in the sky, and a rare type of winter-grade diesel capable of functioning even at -40°C fuel, essential for logistics convoys and armored units operating across Siberia and the Northern Front. Losing this production capacity meant more than an economic setback. It was a direct hit to the Kremlin's military logistics chain. Each halted pump and cracked pipe rippled through the war economy, from airfields on the front lines to factories assembling armored vehicles. Rosneft and Gazprom, the two state-controlled giants that co-owned YANOS, immediately dispatched emergency teams, but they faced an impossible challenge. Russia no longer had access to many of the specialized parts needed for repair. Under sanctions, spare units, compressors and valves had become contraband. As analysts from Reuters and BBC Verify confirmed through satellite imagery, the attack was far more devastating than early reports suggested. The smoke plume stretched 10 kilometers into the sky, indicating structural damage to core distillation towers. Engineers quietly admitted to the press that restarting operations before winter would be technically unrealistic. That single admission sent a chill through the markets and through the Kremlin itself. The choice to label the incident human error was no longer about controlling the narrative. It was about buying time. Every hour of silence was meant to prevent panic from reaching Moscow. Yet inside the corridors of power, that panic had already begun. Military planners warned that without YANOS, fuel reserves for armored divisions could fall dangerously low within weeks. Civil aviation authorities prepared rationing measures. Even the FSB increased patrols around other strategic facilities, terrified that the next explosion could come closer to the capital. The psychological impact spread faster than the fire. For ordinary Russians watching the videos online, the question was no longer whether Ukraine could strike Moscow's infrastructure. It was whether Russia could still protect itself at all. Within days of the YANOS explosion, the crisis spread far beyond the city of Yaroslavl. It was no longer just a local fire, it had become a nationwide fuel emergency. As smoke still hung over the ruins, videos verified by BBC Verify and Reuters began circulating across Russian social media. Endless lines of cars snaked through city streets, stretching for kilometers outside gas stations. Panic had gripped the country. From the outskirts of Moscow to the frozen roads of Siberia, citizens queued through the night, hoping to buy a few remaining liters before supplies disappeared. More than 20 regions, including major industrial centers, reported gasoline rationing. In Novosibirsk, a gas station manager told local media, "We haven't seen a crisis like this since 1993. Many stations are closing down, waiting for the storm to pass, rather than selling at a loss." Those words echoed the dark memories of Russia's chaotic post-Soviet years. For the first time in decades, the country that boasted of being an energy superpower was unable to fuel its own cars, factories, or military. Independent economists estimated that as much as 17% of Russia's refining capacity had been destroyed or disabled by a wave of attacks and sabotage since spring. Some reports placed the figure closer to 38%. The war, once distant, now crept into daily life through shortages, higher prices, and frustration. But beyond the economic shock was something deeper, a silent breakdown in the regime's control mechanisms. Fuel, once a commodity, had turned into a weapon of power and loyalty. The Kremlin declared that all military needs would take priority over civilian consumption. On paper, it sounded logical. In practice, it ignited corruption, black markets, and favoritism across the provinces. The litre of diesel no longer followed market price, it followed paperwork. Those with connections or influence received supply. Those without were left waiting. Factories that depended on solvents, asphalt, and low-sulfur diesel began to halt production. Construction projects slowed, logistics networks froze, and food deliveries across rural regions became irregular. Asphalt shortages led to cracked roads. Clogged filters disabled heavy machinery. The crisis spread like a virus through the body of the economy, invisible yet suffocating. And in the shadow of this chaos, loyalty itself became a form of currency. Regional governors lobbied Moscow for extra allocations of fuel. The Kremlin responded with conditional generosity, loyalty in exchange for supply. The more obedient the region, the faster the trains arrived. In less loyal territories, delays mysteriously multiplied. What began as a refinery fire had mutated into a political disease, one that corroded trust, deepened inequality, and revealed the brittle nature of Putin's centralized control. Russia's vast energy empire, built to sustain wars abroad, was now turning against its own citizens at home. As shortages deepened, one question spread through whispered conversations and encrypted chats. If Moscow cannot protect its energy heart, what will collapse next? The army or the state itself? The YANOS fire had ignited more than oil, it had lit the fuse of a quiet rebellion inside Russia. As the days turned into weeks, the ripple effects reached every corner of the Federation. Trains' slow deliveries stalled and winter supplies failed to arrive on schedule. In provincial cities, citizens whispered that the government was hiding the true scale of the disaster. The once invisible machinery of the state began to grind and stutter. Fuel was no longer simply energy, it had become power itself. In the Kremlin's bureaucratic language, priority supply for the army translated into a new hierarchy of privilege. What began as a temporary measure to ensure military readiness slowly evolved into a permanent policy of control. Fuel flowed not to those who paid, but to those who obeyed. Local officials learned that loyalty to Moscow guaranteed shipments. Disobedience meant empty depots. The market was replaced by paperwork, and paperwork by corruption. Black markets flourished overnight. Tanker drivers demanded bribes to deliver fuel. Warehouse managers falsified storage reports. Every new administrative exception became another opportunity for profit. The system was feeding on itself. According to an investigation by independent outlet Verska, state inspectors in several regions were caught selling government fuel allocations to private traders, a symptom of a collapsing command economy. Meanwhile, the broader economy began to suffocate. Diesel shortages meant fewer trucks on the roads. Railways operated at half capacity. Factories depending on petrochemicals halted production as solvents, paints, and asphalt ran out. In cities, construction projects froze midway, and in rural areas, farms struggled to transport crops to markets. Inflation remained officially stable, yet everyday goods vanished from shelves. Russia had entered a new phase of crisis-invisible inflation where prices stayed the same but availability disappeared. Sociologists called it the fatigue economy. For ordinary families, it meant longer commutes, smaller paychecks, and fewer choices. Educated youth sought online work with foreign companies to survive. Skilled engineers quietly emigrated. The middle class, once Putin's symbol of stability, began to erode. The Kremlin's strategy of control was backfiring, tightening the system until it choked. And within this tightening grip, mistrust began to bloom. Regional governors started using fuel allocations as bargaining chips, demanding more autonomy in exchange for order. In return, Moscow required stronger declarations of loyalty. The circle of power was shrinking, and with it, the regime's capacity to adapt. As loyalty replaced merit, the talent pool within state institutions dried up. Experienced engineers and honest administrators were pushed aside, replaced by political loyalists afraid to tell the truth. The Kremlin's security agencies, driven by paranoia, began to act as mediators in disputes they could barely understand. The state was turning inward, guarding itself from imaginary enemies, even as real ones gathered in the shadows. By mid-October, the true question was no longer about refineries or fuel. It was about survival. Russia's power structure had transformed into a pyramid balancing on fear, and every tremor, every new act of sabotage threatened to bring it crashing down. By the middle of October, the Kremlin's nightmare had materialized. What began as an industrial disaster was now a national security crisis. Inside the halls of the FSB, investigators pored over footage, phone logs, and shift reports from Yaroslavl. No one trusted anyone. Technicians were interrogated, engineers were monitored, even security guards were treated as potential traitors. A fog of suspicion hung over the entire system. Governor Evrayev's earlier statement about human error had detonated a psychological bomb within the Russian bureaucracy. It forced the state to admit, however carefully, that the enemy might not be Ukrainian drones, but Russians themselves. From that moment, the country's vast security machine turned inward. Rather than hunting saboteurs outside the FSB, began chasing ghosts within. Offices were raided, files seized, and anonymous denunciations became the new weapon of survival. Reports leaked to Medusa, and the insider spoke of a growing institutional paranoia. Agents spied on each other. Loyalty tests multiplied. Each regional security branch accused the other of negligence. The once mighty FSB, feared for its omnipresence, was eating itself alive. Meanwhile, beyond the intelligence walls, public morale crumbled. The fire in Yaroslavl had reached the Russian heart, not through heat, but through symbolism. For millions of citizens, the explosion confirmed what they had long suspected, that the Kremlin could no longer protect its own territory. Official polls claimed that 80% of Russians still supported President Putin, but data from Cambridge University's Internet Behavior Study told another story. Online searches for panic attack depression and how to emigrate reached their highest levels since the war began. The propaganda of invincibility was collapsing under the weight of reality. And yet within that despair, something else was awakening defiance. Across Russia, small resistance movements began to act. In Siberia, trains carrying military fuel mysteriously derailed. In Crimea, power substations caught fire overnight. In the Ural region, recruitment offices burned again. The Kremlin called them accidents. But Western think tanks, including the Wilson Center and Center for Applied Analysis, mapped hundreds of confirmed sabotage incidents since the war's first year. They formed a mosaic of rebellions stretching across 11 time zones. These were not random acts of rage. They were coordinated whispers of a silent war. Groups like the Anarcho-Communist Combat Organization and the Crimean partisan cell known as ATSH claimed responsibility for some of the attacks, calling them steps toward liberation. Whether these claims were true or opportunistic, the message was the same resistance lived even in the empire's core. Every new incident forced Moscow to deploy more troops, more police, more surveillance. Yet the more it tightened control, the more fractures appeared. The Kremlin had built its legitimacy on two sacred myths: military invincibility and national unity. Now both were burning, one at the front, the other at home. For Putin's Russia, the question was no longer how to win in Ukraine, but how to keep the war from consuming itself. The blaze that began at YANOS had reached deep into the system's wiring, turning every spark of dissent into a potential explosion. To understand what truly happened in Yaroslavl, analysts looked beyond the smoke and ruins into the core of Russia's own military philosophy. For decades, Moscow's intelligence doctrine rested on a concept known as reflexive control. It was the art of shaping the enemy's decisions without their awareness feeding them false narratives until they acted exactly as planned. This strategy, designed during the Soviet era, had been the pride of Russian psychological warfare, but in Yaroslavl that doctrine was used against the Kremlin itself. The saboteurs, whoever they were, forced the Russian leadership into a perfect reflexive trap. They presented two choices, both disastrous: admit a Ukrainian drone strike and face humiliation before NATO, or admit domestic sabotage and expose internal rebellion. The Kremlin chose the second, and in doing so it surrendered its own narrative weapon. What once manipulated others now controlled Moscow. Governor Evrayev's announcement, meant to contain panic, instead triggered a three-stage collapse inside the regime. First came institutional paranoia, the FSB turning inward, hunting invisible enemies, eroding trust across the chain of command. Second came the collapse of social morale, the recognition among ordinary Russians that the war was no longer far away, but had entered their own cities, their own fuel stations, their own homes. And finally came the spark of rebellion, small but contagious, proving that resistance could wound even the most fortified state. The fire at YANOS did not just destroy steel and machinery, it consumed illusions. It revealed that Russia's war was no longer confined to the battlefields of Ukraine, but was being fought deep inside its own territory, in pipelines, data networks, and political loyalties. And this battle, unlike those in Donbass or Zaporizhzhia, could not be won with tanks or missiles. By late October, even within Putin's loyal circle, quiet panic was spreading. Economic advisors warned that the loss of refining capacity could cripple Russia's military logistics through the winter. Defense officials pleaded for emergency fuel imports from Central Asia. Meanwhile, Western intelligence intercepted reports of rising tension between the Kremlin and regional governors over resource allocation. The once mighty vertical of power, Putin's signature system of control, was now cracking under pressure. The symbolism was brutal. Yaroslavl, a city older than Moscow itself, had become the place where the myth of Putin's invincibility turned to ash. No propaganda campaign, no televised speech could erase the image of that black smoke curling into the Russian sky. Because what burned that day was not just oil. It was the illusion of control, the belief that fear could hold a fractured empire together forever. The story of Yaroslavl is not just about one explosion. It is the story of a system imploding under the weight of its own contradictions, a war that turned inward, a government that can no longer tell friend from foe, and a people slowly waking up from decades of silence. Across Russia, whispers of dissent now echo louder than the sound of missiles. Each act of sabotage, each outage, each silent protest chips away at the foundations of power. The Kremlin can rebuild refineries, it can censor the news, but it cannot erase what the people have seen, a moment when the state itself admitted its greatest fear, that the threat lies within. History may record the YANOS fire as a turning point, the day the empire looked into the mirror and saw its own fracture. From this point forward, every refinery that burns, every blackout that spreads will remind Moscow of that moment when control slipped from its grasp. So the question remains, how many more sparks will it take before the entire structure collapses? If you found this analysis thought-provoking, remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and share your perspective below. What do you think the next chapter of Russia's internal crisis will bring? Reform resistance or total collapse? Stay tuned for our next deep dive report, because the fire that began in Yaroslavl is still burning.